I've spent my entire life in the woods. Camping, fishing, hunting. You name it. When you grow up in the wilderness, you learn the language of the trees. You know the difference between a falling branch and a heavy footstep. I'm also a horror buff. Since I was 10, I've seen every monster Hollywood could throw at me. Nothing rattles me. Or at least, that's what I used to tell myself. About 10 years ago, something happened near Bedford, Pennsylvania, that changed my perspective on the known world. I've only ever told a few people this story, but it's time to get it on the record. My wife and I decided to spend a weekend at a campground. We weren't exactly in the middle of nowhere. We had cell service, and there were other cabins nearby. We were staying in the very last cabin of a row of 3, tucked into the far corner of the grounds where the manicured grass gave way to the dense old-growth forest. The evening was perfect. We sat by the fire, the smell of pine and wood smoke in the air. I even saw a flying squirrel glide past, a rare sight, and a reminder of how peaceful nature can be. We eventually put out the embers and my wife headed inside to get ready for bed. The cabin had a small elevated porch with a single yellow light casting a weak glow onto the grass. Just as I was about to follow her in, my cousin called my cell. Not wanting to wake my wife, I stepped back out onto the porch to talk. I was pacing the porch, just mindless chatter, until I reached the far side, the side facing the dark tree line. I froze. Even now, 10 years later, the hair on my arms is standing up just describing this. There, just 5 feet away from me, at the very edge of the porch light's reach, stood something. It was bipedal, standing on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. It was tiny, no more than 2 feet tall. But it was the color that hit me first. It was a pale, sickly gray, a shade that didn't belong in the woods. It didn't reflect the light. It seemed to absorb it. It just stood there, perfectly still, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out a nose or a mouth, just the silhouette of a head and those unblinking eyes fixed on mine. I didn't scream. I didn't move. My cousin was still talking in my ear, but his voice sounded miles away. I just went silent. Keeping my eyes locked on the creature, I began to shuffle backward toward the cabin door. It never flinched. It didn't growl. It just watched. As soon as I hit the threshold, I hung up the phone and slammed the door. My wife took one look at me and turned pale. She said she had never seen that kind of sheer primal terror on my face in all the years we'd been together. I waited 30 minutes before I worked up the courage to look again. I flicked the porch light off and on. Nothing. The grey thing was gone. The next morning, the sun has a way of making you feel foolish. We went for a hike, had lunch, and I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a strange animal. But then, the afternoon silence was shattered. The entire cabin began to vibrate. The windows rattled in their frames. A roar so loud it felt like it was inside my skull tore through the air. We ran outside and saw them. Military fighter jets, flying so low it felt like you could reach out and touch them. They weren't just passing through. They were circling, sweeping the area with an intensity that felt like a search operation. Was it a coincidence? Or were they looking for the same grey thing I saw standing by my porch the night before? We left shortly after that. We've actually been back to that campground since, and it's been perfectly quiet. But I refused to stay in that specific cabin. Years later, a friend mentioned a legend from the northeast, the Pukwudgie, a small grey forest dwelling being known for watching humans from the shadows. Whether it was a cryptid or something not even from this planet, I don't know. All I know is that the woods aren't always as empty as they seem. Story 2. This next story takes us back much further, to the Great Depression. It was a time when men traveled thousands of miles just for the hope of a paycheck, often finding themselves in corners of the world where the old rules still applied. My grandfather was a full-blood Muskogee Creek native. When the family horse farm in Oklahoma went under, he and his 2 brothers headed north, all the way to the border of Minnesota and Canada, to find work in the logging camps. Before they left, their father gave them one piece of advice: find the local people, talk to the Ojibwe. They know what lives in those woods. Back then, the world wasn't a kind place for native people, but the Ojibwe welcomed my grandfather and his brothers like family. They shared food, tools, and a very specific warning. The elders told them exactly where to camp to avoid trouble with the other loggers, but they emphasized one thing above all else. The Pukwudgies live here, they warned. Every night you must leave an offering on the perimeter of your camp. Whiskey, tobacco, and fry bread. Do not forget. My grandfather and one brother took the warning to heart, but the third brother, he was a skeptic. As they sat around the fire that first night, he laughed it off. He called it a waste of good whiskey and a foolish superstition. He would only stay a skeptic for 24 hours. The second night was freezing. The shadows of the tall pines seemed to stretch toward the fire like long dark fingers. The skeptical brother eventually stood up to relieve himself at the edge of the camp, disappearing into the darkness just past the trail line. Only a few minutes passed before he came sprinting back into the light. He was breathless, his face a ghostly shade of white, and his hands were shaking so violently he could barely speak. He refused to say a word for the rest of the night. It wasn't until lunch the next day that he finally broke his silence. He told them that as he was crouching in the dark, he heard a strange metallic sound. Clink, clink, like glass hitting stone. He looked toward the spot where they had placed the offerings, and his heart nearly stopped. There, in the faint moonlight, was a small grey figure. It had sharp, exaggerated features, distorted and wild. The little being was hunched over, greedily picking through the tobacco and fumbling with the seal on the pint of whiskey. When the brother gasped, the creature didn't run. Not at first. It slowly turned its head and looked him dead in the eye. Then, it peeled back its lips to reveal a wide, jagged, toothy grin. A look of pure ancient mischief. Terrified and caught, quite literally, with his pants down, the brother watched as the creature snatched up the goods and vanished into the undergrowth like a shadow. From that day on, that brother was the first one to the perimeter every evening, laying out the best tobacco they had. He had become a believer in the hardest way possible. But as the months went on, things in the logging camp turned dark. It wasn't just the little people anymore. My grandfather said the woods became active with things they couldn't explain. They saw strange floating lights, what we would call orbs today, dancing between the trees at 3 a.m. Then came the accidents. Men began to die in ways that didn't make sense. Experienced loggers would disappear without a trace. 2 men in a neighboring camp reportedly went completely insane, screaming about things they saw in the brush, and had to be restrained and hauled off the mountain in chains. My grandfather told us this story throughout our entire childhood. When I got older, I asked him if it was just a tall tale meant to keep us out of the woods. He looked at me with a look of absolute stone-cold seriousness. "It is the truth," he said. "We survived that mountain because we respected the things that lived there first. In the deep woods, sometimes the only thing standing between you and the dark is a bit of bread and a pint of whiskey." Story 3. The Pacific Northwest is famous for its beauty, but those who live there know that the deeper you go into the Oregon wilderness, the more the line between reality and legend begins to blur. This story takes us back to the year 2000, near Eugene, Oregon. It's not my personal encounter, but it belongs to a close group of my friends. 4 people who, to this day, cannot talk about that evening without looking over their shoulders. They were teenagers back then, JB and their girlfriends. It was one of those perfect golden Oregon afternoons. They decided to drive out to Mount Hood, Pisgah, to do what teenagers do: hike, swim in the river, and enjoy a bit of freedom away from their parents. The day was uneventful. They parked their small white sedan in the gravel lot and took the main dirt trail down to the water. To get there, they had to cross a small, narrow wooden footbridge over a shallow creek. They spent hours by the river, lost in the haze of summer and the smoke of a campfire. But as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley, hunger kicked in. They packed up their gear and started the 20-minute trek back to the parking lot. The trail was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. As they approached the small footbridge near the exit, B, the driver, looked out into the vast open field that sat between the trail and the dense tree line of the mountain. He stopped dead in his tracks. About 100 yards away, near the edge of the forest, sat a dog. But dog isn't the right word. They all later described it as the largest canine they had ever seen in their lives. Huge, shaggy, and covered in thick matted fur. It was just sitting there in the tall grass watching them. At first they weren't scared. They thought it was just a massive friendly stray. They even joked about how cool it looked in the twilight. They kept walking, stepping onto the wooden planks of the 10-foot bridge. It took them maybe 5 or 6 seconds to cross that bridge. When they reached the other side, one of the girls glanced back at the field and let out a blood-curdling scream. In the 5 seconds it took them to cross that tiny bridge, the creature had covered nearly 70 yards of open ground. But it wasn't sitting anymore. It was standing, on its hind legs, like a man. It was now much closer, looming over the tall grass, its dog-like head perched atop a tall, powerful frame. The most terrifying part? None of them saw it move. Every time they blinked, every time they looked away for a split second, it was suddenly 20 yards closer. It didn't run, it didn't prowl. It simply appeared nearer, as if it were flickering through space. Panic set in instantly. They bolted for the car, the sound of their heavy breathing and boots hitting the gravel echoing through the empty lot. B was fumbling madly with his keys, his hand shaking so hard he couldn't find the lock. "Hurry up! Just open the door!" they screamed. Jay looked back one last time. The creature was now standing at the very edge of the parking lot. It was perfectly still, watching them with a calm, predatory intensity. It still had the face of a dog, the ears of a dog, but it stood there on 2 legs, nearly 7 feet tall, defying every law of nature. The locks finally clicked. They piled in, the engine roared to life, and they peeled out of that lot, leaving a cloud of dust and the standing dog behind them. People asked them if it could have been a bear. but in Lane County, Oregon, especially in that area, bears are practically non-existent, and bears don't move like that. They don't teleport across fields while you're crossing a bridge. To this day, one of the girls has a notebook from 2005 with a sketch she drew of the creature, a shaggy, upright monster that shouldn't exist, but does. Mount Pisgah is still a beautiful place to hike, but if you are there at sunset and you see a large dog sitting at the edge of the woods, whatever you do, don't blink. Story 4. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing in the woods isn't a monster from a legend. Sometimes, it's just a man who has lived in the dark for too long. My grandfather grew up in a quiet coal mining town called Horsepen. Like many towns of that era, everyone knew everyone's business, except for one man. His name was Bob Bowman. Bob lived deep in a place they called a dark hollow, a steep rocky ravine on the outskirts of town where the water ran black from the underground mines. He only came into town once a month to sell animal hides and buy supplies. He never spoke. He only mumbled and grunted incoherently at anyone who dared to address him. People crossed the street when they saw him coming. They said he was as wild as the animals he hunted. One winter, the only man who tolerated Bob, the general store owner, noticed something. Bob hadn't shown up for his monthly visit. At first, the local men huddled around the store's wood-burning stove didn't care. But as the weeks passed, curiosity turned into a dark kind of excitement. A group of them decided to form a posse. They wanted to see if the wild man was dead, or if the rumors about his strange life were true. They hiked deep into the hollow, following the blackened stream up the mountain until the air grew cold and the trees grew thick. There, in a dip in the hillside, they found it. A listing. One-room shack made of logs and tar paper. The store owner pushed aside a heavy animal pelt that served as a door. Inside, the shack was lifeless. No Bob. But in the rock and mud fireplace, a few live coals were still glowing red, a sign that someone had been there very recently. Most of the men were ready to leave, feeling a bit foolish. But the youngest member of the group began poking around the animal bones and trash scattered outside. He came across a small outbuilding, something that looked like a rough outhouse. He swung the door open expecting a stench. Instead, he found a shrine. The walls were lined with animal bones, meticulously arranged like prizes. And there, on a single shelf illuminated by 2 flickering half-burnt candles, sat 3 human skulls. They were perfectly cleaned, white and gleaming in the candlelight, staring back at the young man with empty sockets. The group stood in a collective horrified stupor, staring at the shelf of trophies. The silence was only broken by a sound that chilled them to the bone. A distant, rhythmic grunting and mumbling coming from the woods above them. Bob was coming home. In his territory in the fading light, no one wanted to stay and ask questions. The men broke into a dead run. Some said they heard Bob chasing them through the brush, his incoherent mumbles getting closer and closer until they reached the edge of the town's clearing. No one ever saw Bob Bowman again. He never returned to town, and no one was brave enough to go back into that hollow to see if those skulls had been joined by a 4th. My grandfather still remembers seeing Bob on the streets of Horsepen, the way he looked right through people, as if he was seeing something they couldn't. I've seen the entrance to that hollow myself, but I've never set foot inside. Some secrets are better left in the dark. Story 5. For our final story, we head to the lake country of Muskoka in Ontario, Canada. It's a place of breathtaking beauty. Clear water, dense pine forests, and quiet cottages. 3 years ago, I took a summer job there, staying in a cottage perched high on a rock face overlooking a lake. The property was beautiful but isolated. A long, steep set of wooden stairs led from the main house down to the water's edge, where there was a boathouse and a small separate sauna building. After a long, grueling shift that ended at 11 p.m., I was exhausted. My muscles were aching, and I needed to unwind. I asked my roommates if they wanted to hit the sauna, but they were already halfway through a bottle of whiskey and declined. So, I grabbed my towel and headed down the long flight of stairs alone. The sauna was perfect. I sat there in the sweltering heat for 10 minutes, dousing the rocks with water until the steam was thick. When I couldn't take the heat anymore, I did what we always did. I stepped out into the cool night air to plunge into the lake. The only light came from the small lamp inside the sauna, casting a dim orange glow on the path. Everything else was pitch black. I waded into the water. It was freezing. When the water reached my knees, I stopped to catch my breath. Suddenly, a loud, long, and incredibly clear whistle cut through the silence. Woo-hoo! I froze. Every nerve in my body lit up. My first thought was that it was a bird, or maybe one of my roommates trying to pull a prank. I waited, scanning the dark tree line just a few yards away. I decided to play along. I whistled back a short, simple tune. Woo-woo! Almost before I could finish, the exact same tone came back from the darkness. Same pitch, same cadence. Now I was unsettled. No animal mimics that perfectly. I decided to test it. I whistled a bizarre sporadic pattern, something no bird could possibly produce. Whew, 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 whew. Instantly, it came back. Whew, 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 whew. It didn't miss a single beat. And this time, the sound didn't come from the tree line. It sounded like it was standing right at the edge of the water, barely 10 feet away from me. A paralyzing chill washed over me. I realized that my roommates were hundreds of yards away, up a massive flight of stairs, inside a thick-walled cottage. There was no way they could be out here without me seeing them past the sauna light. I didn't wait for a third whistle. I scrambled out of the lake, ignored my towel, and sprinted up those stairs faster than I ever thought possible. I burst through the front door, gasping for air, expecting to see my friends laughing at their clever joke. But they were all sitting exactly where I left them, mid-conversation, with their drinks in hand. They hadn't moved. When I asked if anyone had been outside, they just looked at me with confusion. No, man. We've been right here the whole time. The room went dead silent. At the time, I didn't know the legends. I didn't know that in many cultures, whistling at night is seen as an invitation to things that don't have voices of their own. Things that mimic us to draw us closer into the dark. I did my research later. Now I know why you should never whistle in the woods of the north. I still go to the lake. I still use the sauna. But now, as I step out into the night chill, I merge with the silence. Because I know there is something in the woods that is listening very closely, and it is always ready to answer. What do you think of these stories? If you've ever experienced anything like this, share it in the comments below.